We'll now discuss chapters 4 and 5, which deal with ventilation, air, and exhaust systems. We just have a little bit of information to cover for chapter 14, which is ventilation air, and that deals specifically with the types of filters that are required to be installed in HVAC systems and return air supplies. This particular section 401.2 has been relocated from its previous location in the 2016 CMC, which was section 503.3. The most significant change here that's identified is the fact that the minimum efficiency reporting value, or MERV, is required to be 13, which is a change from the previous code cycle, which only required a MERV rating of 8. These filters have got to be clearly labeled, indicating their MERV rating. New filters of the compliant MERV rating of 13 are required to be installed prior to occupancy. And the O&M Manuals have to also identify that replacement of the filters must comply with a MERV 13 rating. Now we'll start talking about Chapter 5 in the California Mechanical Code, which deals with exhaust systems. Chapter 5 is divided into two parts, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 identifies requirements for environmental air ducts and product conveying systems. With respect to environmental air ducts, these ducts have got to be installed in compliance with Chapter 6 of the CMC, and they must be airtight. The exhaust ducts are required to terminate outside the building and be equipped with backdraft dampers or motorized dampers that automatically shut when the space is not used. These ducts are required to terminate a minimum of 3 feet from the property line and from any building openings, terminate 10 feet minimum from any forced air inlet, and are not permitted to discharge into a public walkway. The next type of exhaust system is a product conveying system. These particular systems are somewhat rarely seen. However, we could expect to see them in, say, technology type classrooms, where you may have automotive classes or carpentry classes or steel fabrication classes, and also possibly in some laboratory settings where there's a possibility that toxic fumes or corrosive fumes may be expelled during the lab. These particular product conveying systems are classified into 5 separate classes, and they are Class 1, which includes non-abrasives being conveyed, such as smoke, spray mist fogs, fumes, some gases, and light fine dust or powders. Class 2 is considered moderately abrasive, and these would be products such as sawdust, grain dust, buffing or polishing dust, etc. Class 3 includes any high concentration of Class 2 product conveying systems, or a highly abrasive product being conveyed that is in low concentrations, such as manganese, steel chips, coke, etc. Class 4 is for high concentrations of highly abrasive materials being conveyed, and Class 5 is set aside for corrosives, such as acid vapors. Ductwork that conveys any explosive or flammable vapors, fumes, or dusts have got some special requirements, obviously. They're required to terminate 30 feet minimum from the property line and any combustible walls or openings into the building in the direction of the discharge. They must terminate 10 feet minimum from all building openings and above adjoining grade. They're also required to terminate 6 feet minimum from exterior walls and roofs. Now, ducts that convey other products, which are other meaning not explosive or flammable vapors, fumes, or dusts, are required to terminate 10 feet minimum from the property line, building openings, and above adjoining grade, and 3 feet minimum from exterior walls and roofs. We have some new amendments to Section 506 relating to product conveying ducts, specifically 506.3, which deals with penetrations, stipulates that exhaust ducts must not pass through firewalls. Now, with respect to fire barriers, there are some allowances. Exhaust ducts which do pass through fire barriers rated over 2 hours or in excess of 2 hours require some additional protection, such as fire-resistive construction and fire stopping. Ducts in these areas that may have condensate, which has a potential to collect inside, must include condensate protection and additional provisions, which we're not going to talk about in detail, but may include drainage. Also, duct clearances are slightly different, and additional clarification and requirements are provided in Section 506.10. We're not going to talk much about this except to say that it is worth looking at these particular new amendments just to become familiar with their requirements in the event that you may get on a project where these are being utilized. Part 2 of Chapter 5 deals with commercial hoods and kitchen ventilation. Section 507.1 basically modified its title. That's why you see it indicated in red font and underlined. So they've identified this specifically as Type 1 hood exhaust systems. The details for exhaust requirements for cooking equipment that produces either smoke or grease-laden vapors are provided in this section. The interior surfaces of these types of ductwork that are used to convey any type of grease-laden vapors or smoke has got to remain accessible for cleaning and inspection. Since cleaning is required on a periodic schedule to keep the fire hazard down, and inspection of the functioning of the duct itself has got to be done periodically and on a consistent basis. These types of ducts must obviously maintain clearances from any type of combustible materials. All Type 1 hoods are required to be installed per their listing. Type 1 hoods are required above any commercial cooking equipment, such as commercial fryers, broilers, grills, etc., and any similar equipment that produces either grease or smoke in the food processing establishment. These types of hoods are required to be installed in accordance with their listing and the manufacturer's installation instructions. They're required to be constructed of 18 gauge minimum steel or 20 gauge minimum stainless steel, or per their listing. These ducts have got to be liquid tight, and the joints in the seams are required to be continuously welded. The ductwork has got to remain cleanable, and listed grease filter or grease removal devices are required to be provided. These Type 1 hood exhaust duct systems are not permitted to pass through firewalls or fire partitions. They are not permitted to be interconnected with any other building ventilation or exhaust system. Any type of dip or trap is not permitted in these types of ducts, and they are required to be sloped 2% minimum back to the hood for lengths of duct that are less than or equal to 75 feet. And they're also required to slope a minimum of 8% back to the hood For any ductwork runs that are 75 feet, greater than 75 feet, drains are required to be provided at the low points in the horizontal ducts or in compliance with their listing. These drains are also required to be permanently welded. The Type 1 exhaust duct system must be installed, again, in accordance with their listing and the manufacturer's installation instructions. Because Type 1 hood exhaust systems convey grease-laden vapors or grease itself, it's important that at least one 20-inch by 20-inch personnel access panel is provided for cleaning and inspection purposes. This particular access panel has got to be provided in the horizontal ductwork, either on the top or the sides of the duct, and at any changes in direction. As an exception, in the event when this personnel access is not possible, sufficiently sized openings, a minimum of 12 foot on center, are required in its place to facilitate cleaning and inspection of the inside of the ductwork. These access panels are also required within 3 feet of each side of a fan. They're required to be provided with a sign that states access panel, do not obstruct. They're required to be made of the same material and the same thickness as the ductwork they're installed in, and they must include a gasket or a seal that's rated at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and are also required to be grease tight. No mechanical fasteners are permitted to penetrate these ducts, and leakage tests are required to be performed prior to them being covered up or used. And these leakage tests can include using light as a test method, using water pressure, or also using another approved equivalent method. The test method must comply with the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, publication number 154. They are required to be factory built. Grease ducts are also permitted as long as they're factory built and listed to Underwriters Laboratory number 1978. These images depict a variety of joints that you would expect to see in Type 1 hood ductwork. The image on the left is showing basically a telescoping duct joint, where you have kind of a lap joint, and a modified fillet weld is going to be installed all the way around the joint itself. The important characteristic to take from this particular image is the fact that the ductwork itself in this configuration is going to guarantee that the grease that's trapped inside of the ductwork remains in the ductwork, and the grease is actually going to shingle off of the upper piece of ductwork onto the lower piece of ductwork, and there'll never be a situation where the lap itself is going to contain grease. As an alternate, the images on the right show flanged joints, and a couple varieties for actually welding the flanged joints. The one on the left is basically depicting a situation where you're going to weld the joints continuously, obviously all the way around, and it's more of a butt configuration, but not necessarily a butt weld, of course. The image just to the right of that depicts a situation where one of the flanges, the top section of ductwork's flanges, is a little bit shorter than the flange on the bottom section of the ductwork, thereby providing the ability to install more of a fillet weld on that particular joint. And it's required that the joints, whatever the joints are externally welded. Those are generally required. However, it is permitted to also internally weld any of these joints, permitted that the finished joint is smooth and it's also readily accessible. So readily accessible means that, again, that nothing is required to be removed to view the joints. So we would expect to see internally welded joints only in situations where you could actually see the joint. For instance, the hood itself, or maybe some other areas where nothing has got to be removed. But as a general rule, also, butt welding connections are not permitted. Now, with respect to requirements for moving the air within the ducts, there are certain requirements that take allowances or take into consideration that grease is being conveyed within the ducts. Obviously, if grease is being conveyed, then grease is going to have a propensity to collect somewhere in the fans, and the fans that are used to move the duct in these grease applications have got to be designed and installed to take that into account. So for commercial cooking applications where grease is a consideration, generally speaking, the fans are going to be installed at a rooftop termination point, and they have to comply with a couple of requirements. One of the main ones being that the grease that's going to be collected has to have some method for being drained. So for Upblast fans, the grease is going to be drained directly to a readily accessible grease receptacle, which is 1 gallon max in size. And of course, this receptacle is going to have to be emptied by staff, maintenance personnel on a regular basis. In the event that an inline fan is installed in this type of ductwork, it's required to be located outside of the airstream, easily accessible, and additionally a grease drain to a similar grease receptacle may be required. But in no situation is a flex connector permitted in an inline fan application. For any utility set fan, there are basic requirements, and that is they must drain directly to a readily accessible grease receptacle, again, that is 1 gallon max in size, and a flexible connector is permitted at the rooftop, but again, a flexible connector is never permitted within the building. This image of an Upblast fan shows the standard clearances. It shows obviously a standard profile of an Upblast fan, but also shows some of the standard clearances that are required, taken with respect to the prevailing wind direction, and it's just for informational purposes in an attempt to show what the dimensions are. Also associated with air movement is a new section, section 511.2.2.2, which addresses requirements for capture and containment tests that are now required for Type 1 hood exhaust duct systems. And generally speaking, the owner is required to verify the capture and containment performance of the Type 1 hood assemblies. And this includes a visual field test, and this visual field test is conducted with all fans operating and all cooking equipment at their operating temperatures. The steam or smoke that is generated, the movement of the steam and the smoke is going to be observed, and it's going to be verified being captured by the hood itself. There is a provision that instead of using steam and smoke, that simulated smoke generation systems or products are used, such as smoke candles or smoke puffers. Section 513 addresses the requirement for fire extinguishing equipment to be installed in Type 1 hood configurations. Obviously, since the major threat is the fact that with conveying grease or grease-laden vapors, there's always a possibility that the grease itself may actually combust. So cooking equipment that produces grease or grease vapors are required to be protected by specific fire extinguishing equipment. And these types of equipment are, number one, a listed and labeled automatic fire extinguishing system. And these are required to be UL 300 compliant. These systems are supposed to be installed in compliance with their listing, the manufacturer's installation instructions, and either NFPA 12, NFPA 13, NFPA 17, or NFPA 17A, dependent on the exact type of system that's installed. Manual activation of the system is also required to be provided. And the manual activating button, chain, or device is required to be located between 42 and 48 inches above finished floor and at a distance of 10-foot minimum to 20-foot maximum from the hood that's being protected, and also on the path of egress from the area or from the room where the hood is located. The other required type of fire extinguishing equipment is a Type K fire extinguisher, and there are also requirements for the placement of this particular extinguisher that is identified in Section 513.2. Section 519 of Chapter 5 addresses Type 2 hood exhaust system requirements, and Type 2 hood exhaust systems are characterized by the fact that they transmit steam, heat, odors, and other products of combustion, but definitely they do not transmit grease or smoke. Because of this, they are permitted to be constructed of a more lenient construction methodology. For instance, the materials that are used in these types of systems are permitted to be constructed of 24 gauge minimum steel. The joints in the seams themselves are required to be substantially tight and adequately sealed, but they are not required to be welded like Type 1 hood exhaust systems. Additionally, ducts and plenums that are serving Type 2 hoods are required to be constructed of rigid metallic materials and in compliance with Chapter 6 of the California Mechanical Code.